All right. Thanks everybody for joining. We're going to go ahead and get started. Forgive the delay here, but my name is Graham Hamilton, and I serve as the U.S. Policy Officer for Break Free from Plastic. I'm really happy to be here and would like to thank Angelica for extending the invitation to be with you here for the National Recycling Congress. I'm really happy to be joined by my colleagues Nick Lapis with Californians Against Waste and Jan Dell at the last beach cleanup. Really looking forward to the conversation and the presentations today. While you're listening in, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat and we'll go ahead and save them for after the presentations have wrapped up. And before I kind of hand things over to Nick and Jan, I would like to start by giving y'all a high-level overview of the Break Free from Plastic movement that I'm hoping will kind of help to frame our discussion. So again, my name is Graham Hamilton. I use he, him pronouns, and I serve as the U.S. Policy Officer for Break Free from Plastic. My work specifically is focused on organizing Break Free members around domestic policy initiatives and building connective tissue between plastic pollution interventions that exist at the local, state, and federal levels, as well as coordinating member engagement around the upcoming intergovernmental negotiating committees for the Global Plastics Treaty. Go ahead and next slide. So Break Free from Plastic is a global movement that envisions a future free from plastic pollution. Our member organizations and individuals share the common values of environmental protection and social justice. We work together through a holistic approach in order to bring about systemic change. Now, what this means is that we're all in various ways focused on tackling plastic pollution across the entire supply chain, from extraction to disposal. Our work is primarily centered around four key pillars. So the first of which is stopping petrochemical buildout and the harms that are associated with existing infrastructure. It's about holding polluting corporations accountable. And this is companies ranging from chemical manufacturers to fast-moving consumer goods companies. We're advocating for systemic solutions that are embedded in environmental justice. And we're working to foster the zero waste communities of the future. Next slide. So our global movement is currently made up of 355 core organizations ranging from frontline environmental justice groups like the Carrizo Comecrudo tribe of Texas and East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice to larger NGOs like Greenpeace, Oceana, Sierra Club, etc. Next slide. Break Free members, we currently operate in 6 global regions, including Africa, Latin America, the US, Europe, China, and the Asia Pacific region. Although I think that we are on the verge of bringing in our first members from the Middle East, which is very, very exciting. Next slide. Yeah, and in this slide, the blue survey points kind of show our current core members who are operating here in the US. We have over 170 core member organizations here in the United States. And the way that our movement kind of functions is that representatives from these organizations are working in at least one of 7 key work streams. Our work streams include petrochemicals, state and federal policy, communications, global narrative, corporate campaigning, zero waste communities, and our newest work stream, which encompasses burning. So that's, think, traditional incineration as well as nouveau industry ploys to burn mixed plastic waste using pyrolysis and gasification, all in the name of recycling. Next slide. And here, you're going to get a quick snapshot of the member organizations. Again, the blue survey points representing members. These are all folks that are working to stop the petrochemical industry from poisoning communities across the country, from Richmond, California, to the Gulf South and Appalachia beyond. The diamonds that you see here indicate active petrochemical site fights that our members are engaging in. And the stars indicate rapidly growing networks of so-called chemical recycling infrastructure that our members are also working to confront. So, as I'm sure all of y'all are well aware, the plastics industry is working overtime to sell lawmakers and communities on the false solution of so-called chemical recycling, with proposals for new plants seeming to pop up every week. In the meantime, in the time between creating this presentation and today, there have been 2 new projects that have been announced that are actually not represented on this map. ExxonMobil's Baytown plant in Texas and the plastic gas operation in New Mexico. So it already needs to be updated. Next slide, please. Again, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, but for decades, we know that the plastics and chemical industry has sought to lay blame for the global waste crisis on consumers rather than producers. And over the years, that narrative has steadily begun to erode. And as public awareness of the issue has grown, the industry continues to manipulate public perception by pointing to the symptoms of the problem while intentionally hiding the disease, so to speak. Next slide. And the truth, again, which I trust y'all are aware of, is that plastic is an inherently toxic fossil fuel-based product that pollutes at every single point in the supply chain, from fracked feedstocks to petrochemical refinement, to the phthalates in myriad consumer products, and the emissions that are associated with landfilling and burning. Microplastics and their toxic chemical constituents are virtually everywhere on planet Earth. They're in our tap water, our table salt on the slopes of Mount Everest, and in the Marianas Trench. They're found in the digestive tracts of marine and terrestrial animals alike. And there is now evidence showing plastic in human lung tissue, in breast milk, and cord blood. Next slide. So the elephant in the room, as countries work to decarbonize the transportation and energy sectors, the fossil fuel industry is banking on petrochemical expansion and a future of limitless plastic production and consumption to secure their bottom line. The plastics and chemical industries are now preaching a circular economy for plastics that will be magically delivered by so-called advanced chemical recycling schemes. But I think we all are well aware, and it goes without saying, but we cannot recycle our way out of the global plastic pollution crisis. The most effective and trusted solutions lie in production cuts, source reduction, product redesign, and non-toxic reuse. There's no doubt that there's plenty of downstream waste for society to deal with. But until we're actually reaching for the root cause of the problem, we're just going to continue to confine ourselves to scratching at the symptoms, while the number of frontline communities who are hit first and worst across the country continues to grow. So again, that's the primer for this conversation moving forward. I'm really looking forward to hearing from my colleagues, Nick and Jan. And with that, again, please put any questions that you have into the chat and we'll address them after we've had a chance to hear from both Nick and Jan. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nick.
Hey folks, Nick Lapis with Californians Against Waste. Thank you, Graham, for that amazing intro. You always do a great job. Always makes me proud to be I think we're one of the early members of the Break Free from Plastic movement. I am going to share my screen. Give me 1 second. Okay, can everyone see that? So I'm going to talk specifically about truth in environmental advertising, especially when it comes to plastics. There are a lot of things we've worked on in California, and rather than trying to cover everything we've done, I figured it would probably make more sense to do a deeper dive into this specific issue that Jan and I have done a lot of work on over the last few years. So just a quick word on CAW. We're an environmental organization based in Sacramento, work on waste and recycling policy, and we've been around for, I think, 45 years now. We are actually hiring. If anybody's interested, send me an email. My contact info is, well, you can just Google me, but it's also on the last slide. So a word on kind of our overarching narrative and our overarching thesis here, and what has driven a lot of our work in the last few years, is we've really wanted to move away from the old paradigm of recyclable and compostable mean that something is capable of being recycled or capable of being composted. And folks, tend to think, well, that's the obvious definition, right? Like this styrofoam tray is recyclable because we can smush it into a picture frame. And so it is capable of being recycled. But realistically, everything is capable of being recycled if you have enough of it in one place. And, it doesn't mean that's economically feasible, environmentally feasible, or happens at any great enough scale. So the distinction of it's the inherent character of a material is not actually a very good distinction. And so recyclability and compostability is about the inherent characters of materials, right? But beyond that, it's also direction to consumers. It's telling consumers what bin to put something into. If you call something recyclable, people put it in the recycling bin. If you call it compostable, they will put it in the composting bin. And then the third factor, in my mind, the third other important factor is that it's a way to differentiate yourself from other products in the market, to basically give yourself a green sheen and have people not feel as guilty about purchasing your product versus somebody else's. And that's where a fairness issue comes in with making claims that are not necessarily substantiated by what's really going to happen in the waste system in California. If you call yourself recyclable, but there's no recycling infrastructure, or same thing with compostable, then you are claiming an environmental attribute that isn't fair, and creates a competitive issue with folks who have created recycling markets for their material types, or who aren't making any claims because they know it is deceptive. What it boils down to in my mind is it's not recyclable if it doesn't get recycled, and it's not compostable if it doesn't get composted. So that's sort of the overarching theory that's led to a variety of bills we've done over the last few years. Notably, last year, Gavin Newsom signed a couple bills on recyclability and compostability claims that are the furthest that I believe any state has gone, and that I think could be an interesting model for other states and countries as well. The first of the bills is SB 343 by Senator Ben Allen, and it builds on our existing laws we have on recyclable claims. We've had legislation on the books since the 90s saying you cannot make a recyclable claim unless your product is, to oversimplify it, basically, unless it meets the FTC guidelines for recyclability. And so a couple problems with that. One is that it applied to the word recyclable, but did not apply to the symbols that people associate with recycling, like the chasing arrow, the Mobius strip. It also did not apply to saying statements like, bring it back to the store for recycling, which I know is Jan's pet peeve, personal pet peeve, where you're not necessarily saying it's recyclable, but you're heavily implying it by saying, bring it back for recycling. So the scope did not cover that, but probably more importantly, it did not touch on on anything beyond whether or not consumers had access to recycling for that material. So it boiled down to, do a majority of blue bins accept that material? And as more and more markets developed for mixed plastics to be just hand sorted overseas, there are more and more jurisdictions that basically said, well, we'll take all plastic. And so this became a more meaningless distinction over time. And a lot of plastics manufacturers lobbied local governments to be added to the recycling system purely so that they could claim recyclability. And so whether or not it was being recycled, they were lobbying to be added. So this bill expands that. it expands it to a variety of criteria. It sort of boils down to, we're keeping the consumers have to have curbside access. We're not getting rid of that. But on top of that, it has to realistically get sorted at most material recovery facilities in the state, or material recovery facilities serving most of the population. And routinely, not get picked out one by one sometimes, but routinely get sorted. It has to have solid markets. The markets have to be legal markets. A market can't be in violation of the Basel Convention. It can't have things added to it that inhibit recycling, or make that individual product unrecyclable. There's some prohibitions on PFAS and some other criteria, but that's kind of the general gist of it. And so the way it works is that CalRecycle is our state agency in charge of recycling. They're basically tasked with taking a first cut of identifying broad categories of materials that meet the sorting and curbside access requirements. So they're doing both surveys of MRFs and material recovery facilities, and some other research where they're basically going to say something along the lines of, we looked at the entire state and it seems like plastic water bottles, number one, PET water bottles, are generally collected in most of the communities. Most MRFs separate them. They have, their PET reclaimers in California who will buy them. So we can check all those boxes. But that's not sufficient. So the second step falls on the manufacturers. And the manufacturers, even if they fall under that category that is being listed by CalRecycle, still have to ensure that they meet the other requirements. So going back to the PET water bottle example, PET water bottles might be recyclable, but if you're, say, using a pigment, you can no longer call yourself recyclable because there aren't necessarily markets for most pigmented PET. If you're using adhesives that don't break down or in the recycling process, or vinyl wraps, or anything else that is a violation of the APR design guidelines or of the requirements in the bill, then even if you're in that broader category, you still can't use the term recyclable. There's an unnecessarily probably complicated slide, but CalRecycle, the state agency, put out some cool infographics on the process. And so this basically just recaps what I said. So what CalRecycle is doing, what their portion of the process is the top chart. So they're doing a material characterization study of MRFs and reporting from MRFs to them in terms of markets. And then they're going to, based on that, publish their list of things that are collected and sorted for recycling in California. And then after that, manufacturers have a couple years to phase out the use of chasing arrows or any recyclability claims on products that are not on that list, or that are on that list but don't meet the other requirements in the bill. So let me switch to degradability claims for a while. So we've been working on degradability claims in California going back to 2004. And unlike the recyclability, with recyclability, we had a landmark bill in the early 90s, and then it was sort of quiet until now, and then we did this big bill last year. With degradability, there have been a series of bills, I believe 6 bills now, that have sort of ramped up over time. So starting with plastic bags, expanding to food service containers, expanding to all plastic, expanding eventually to all product types. And prior to this most recent legislation, prior to AB 1201, the general summary of what California law required is that you're not allowed to make any degradability claim with 3 exceptions. So you're not allowed to call something biodegradable, degradable, decomposable, photodegradable, oxodegradable. You can't say degrades in a landfill. You can't in any way imply that something will decompose or biodegrade unless you're in one of 3 categories. One is you can call yourself compostable if you meet one of the two relevant ASTM standards. And so there are a lot of ASTM standards, but these are the only two you're allowed to meet. You're allowed to call yourself home compostable if you meet the TÜV Austria standard for home compostability. And there's a one-off for soil biodegradability. That's kind of a narrow exemption. If CalRecycle adopts a standard for soil biodegradability, then you can use that term in non-consumer facing interactions. So in commercial interactions. Super narrow for the third one. Basically comes down to you can say compostable or home compostable if you meet the standards. And what AB 1201 did is it expanded that further. So first of all, expanded it from plastic to all materials. And one reason why that was important for us is there were a lot of molded fiber products that were using, things like PFAS coatings that were contaminating compost. And we were getting into a lot of just philosophical debates about which bioplastics are plastic and which are naturally derived polymers that are not plastic. And 1201 basically said, doesn't matter. This applies to everybody. It also requires labeling that distinguishes the product from non-compostable products. And it gives CalRecycle the authority to regulate what that labeling looks like and set standards for both what labeling is allowed and what labeling is prohibited to avoid lookalike products. We prohibit the use of perfluorinated compounds like PFAS and PFOA chemicals. That's kind of the things that went into effect right away at the beginning of this year. And then we had two other requirements that are going to be hard to meet that have a slightly delayed phase-in. One is, actually, sorry, before I get to that, another requirement that was a really big deal for us that is in effect right now is you're only allowed to call something compostable if it is a product that brings in other organics with it. In other words, you can say a bin liner, a compostable bin liner is compostable because it's used to collect organics and, that facilitates the collection of desirable organic waste. But you can't under any circumstance call a tennis shoe compostable, no matter what standards it meets. Same thing with the cell phone cases and pens and everything else we've seen that people have tried to call compostable. Starting 2024, we require third-party certification with the state agency, CalRecycle, approving the certifiers. And then starting 2026, we prohibit the use of the term compostable for any products that are not allowed in organic, as an organic input in organic agriculture. And the reason for that is right now, if composters take any compostable plastics whatsoever, they can no longer sell their compost to organic farmers because it's seen as a synthetic input that's not on the list of allowable synthetic inputs. Super wonky. I should probably not go down the rabbit hole too much, but generally speaking, that means that the market for compost that has compostable plastics is tiny and the compost is worth significantly less. So the reason there's a 2026 date there is that it gives time for that industry to try to figure out, how to get some products on the list or see if there's some way to get the NOP list changed. It doesn't say, we're not sure if that'll be successful. And if it fails, if they don't get a single product on the national organic product list, then that would prohibit all compostability claims in California. And there's a provision for the state to extend that one time if they're close. So you might be asking yourself, why are we being so mean to the compostable people? Why do we make them meet all those requirements that regular plastic does not have to meet? Aren't we stifling innovation? Aren't we keeping that industry from succeeding? And frankly, this is the answer. The answer is composters largely do not want these materials right now. And this is a letter that the composters in Oregon put out basically saying that they all joined together and said, we collectively will not accept compostable plastics at any of our facilities in Oregon. And they identified a lot of the issues that we're trying to address in that previous legislation. So and if you notice, you know, the same folks who operate in Oregon have a lot of facilities in California as well. And so I think where this was headed, generally speaking, was a similar prohibition in California. 1201, the legislation I was referring to, kind of set some conditions of, can we have a narrow universe of products that we will accept at composting facilities? Ones that don't violate NOP, ones that aren't tennis shoes, ones that don't have PFAS coatings. Can we start identifying the small universe and accept those? And that is the reason for the bill, and why both most of the manufacturers and the composters supported it. In terms of enforcement, most of our enforcement is left up to the district attorneys and to the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General, going back to Kamala Harris, has taken an active role in enforcing some of these laws. And then we have a group of 24 district attorneys that work together on enforcement as well. And so there have been a bunch of high-profile legal cases, multi-million-dollar settlements, significantly more cases than you've actually heard of, because usually, if I understand correctly, they start off by sending a cease and desist. And it's only if, you know, people don't follow the law that, or don't respond, that it eventually ends up in this really expensive settlement. So we have this group of district attorneys that have been taking on this enforcement role. And then, you know, just in terms of relevance, last week or this week, all kind of a blur. In the past week, our current Attorney General, Rob Bonta, put out a statement basically calling on manufacturers of plastic bags to prove that they meet the recyclability standards. And the reason that's important is that our bag ban has an exemption for bags that are reusable and recyclable and have recycled content. And the recyclable provision is going to be very hard for most of the bag manufacturers to prove. And a lot of that was spurred by Jandel's advocacy and lawsuits. So I'll let her talk about that. And then I'll just touch on this. You know, it's one of the other things that we've been doing is we've been trying to change what is considered recycling, what is considered diversion in California. So in the past couple of years, we've prohibited the counting of mixed plastic exports from counting as recycling. And this past year, we prohibited incineration from counting as recycling, both of which had been allowed for decades. I like to joke that I've done more to reduce our recycling rate than anybody in the state. But it's kind of inside joke. Here's a photo of my son, but more importantly, my contact info. The QR code will take you to my contact info, and feel free to reach out with any questions or if you're looking for a job. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nick. That was great. We've got a handful of questions that I think we're going to go ahead and save until after we hear from Jan. So without further ado, is that all right, Jan, if we go to you? Are you ready? All right.
Can you see my screen? Yay. Well, Nick, it's so hard to follow after a cute kid. Thank you for setting me up. What a cute kid. So it's great to talk with everybody today. I see we're at 12:32 Pacific time, and I think we have till 1 in total, Graham. Is that right? So great. I have time to talk a bit, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. It's great to talk with you today. I'm Jan Dell, the founder and an independent engineer of the Last Beach Cleanup. I'm a tiny 501c3, just me, but I work with other NGOs on the issue of stopping plastic pollution. And then we were asked to speak today. Actually, the title was around single-use plastics, and then we've kind of morphed it into talking about other things. And what I'm going to talk about is facts over fiction, and product recycling and product labeling, which Nick sort of just addressed, but I'm going to get into some other issues as well. And so just going back to this slide, this is what motivates me, and what motivated me to name my NGO The Last Beach Cleanup. Is I'm seeing over the years, I grew up near the beach. I live near the beach in California. I started seeing so much celebration about how many bags of plastic waste we clean up at the beach. I thought, wait, that's not the right metric. The metric is putting ourselves out of business on beach cleanups, right? That's what we should be working for. And so that is my goal, is to get to the last beach cleanup, because that is a proxy. This is a proxy. If you have clean beaches around the world, then there's going to be a lot of less plastic waste in general, right? And a lot of less harm to the environment. So, in general, this is what the route I think we should take.
Hang on. I'm sorry, Jan. Hang on a second.
Oh.
I'm seeing folks saying that the slides are not changing. Let's see.
Let me put this in
presentation mode. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, let me do presentation mode. Okay. Is that better?
Is that better, folks? It works on my end, but I'm not sure.
She's still on the wrong. Yeah, she's on the notes screen. She needs to do the full. She may have two screens. You need to see the presenters.
Oh, back to that. Okay. Is that better?
That's the same screen.
Let's see. Maybe I need to unshare. Oh, I don't want to take all of our time. Screen. Doing this. Let's see. I'm going to. I'm sure what I should do here. Oh, is that better?
There you go. I think that.
Oh, hooray! Okay, sorry, that was 1 minute of our time. Okay, so whoops, I got to go back one now. All right, so I think this is the path to get to, and we're on slide. It says step 1, 2, and 3. Good. Okay. So here's the problem we've got in the world. We've got too much plastic pollution, which is a sign of too much plastic waste. And I think we can all be in agreement. It's not what we want on the planet. It's not good for anybody. This is what Graham went over from start to finish, all the harms from making oil and gas all the way through the use and the waste. And in my corporate career in 35 years, I worked in 45 countries. I worked from the biggest extreme way up in the North Slope of Alaska, all the way through making toys and helping beverage companies. And so I've been through the whole supply chain. So this is what I think is the path to the solution, was that we have to accept science and economic reality. We have to use the facts. We have to stop greenwashing plastics that are not recyclable, that are not good for the planet. And we need to adopt real and rational solutions. This is a picture that I took in Texas in the Brazos River after a storm. Plastic pollution in US rivers. This is not just an Asian problem. And to get to a nice clean beach, these are the 3 steps I think we need to take. And my message to the recycling industry today is, I ask you to be part of the solution, not part of the pollution. Now, I'm sure a lot of you got into this business because you viewed it as an environmentally good thing to be part of, to help, end of pipe take waste and make it into something. But we all need to think way upstream, because it's not working for plastic recycling. It's never worked. And ultimately, we really need to stop greenwashing plastic as being recyclable. When I initially made this PowerPoint, I was thinking that I'd just be talking to MRFs, but I realized that actually the conversation is much bigger. And frankly, I truly understand that there might be people listening to me right now who get their paychecks related to plastic recycling. And I'm sorry, the messages I'm going to show and the facts I'm going to show may come as a threat to you. And I get that. I've had to get a paycheck and had to defend what I was doing and so on. But we all really need to look at this as a big picture, just like other issues in the past have been looked at in a big picture in terms of asbestos, in terms of lead paint, all these issues that there have always been industries trying to defend that ultimately are indefensible and ultimately went away. Okay, and so we really need to deal with the facts and the science on this to really make progress. So I ask you to open your minds to being part of the solution and not part of the pollution. So step one, we need to accept science and economic reality, and that is we are not going to collect, sort, and recycle our way out of the plastic pollution crisis, what ends up in the ocean around the world or, you know, on the street corner. And we're not going to do this on waste in general either. All right, so here's a chart that maybe some of you have seen. I co-authored an Atlantic article with Judith Inc. in May, and these numbers were just cited again in a recent Greenpeace article report that I was a key researcher on. And I know the plastics recycling industry doesn't like this chart, so we can talk about this today. But what the chart shows, the main chart, is the US EPA data since 1980. And it shows this mountain of plastic waste that has grown in the United States way faster than population has grown, you know, on a per capita basis. It's just exploded. We've all seen this in our lives. Things that used to be multi-use now come in all these little pouches and so on. And over the course of time, the green line shows recycling and what recycling achieves. And it only peaked at 9.4% around 2014. And that was when we were exporting about half of it to China. And yeah, we all know now that was not all getting recycled, right? And so plastic recycling has never been this solution to this plastic waste crisis, which is absolutely expanding, especially with the, you know, the expansion of new plastic production that's coming online in America. And it's even worse than, you know, what the EPA has been saying. First of all, unfortunately, their data hasn't been updated since 2018. We're all asking for an update, but we haven't seen that. And then we've got experts, which EREF, which is a environmental research recycling organization, DOE itself, JAMBEC. They've all been saying that the EPA has actually been underreporting how much plastic waste there is, and that we're really at about 51 million tons today and only a recycling rate of 5%. And I can go into on the next slide about how we calculated that in May, but at the same time, the US DOE came out literally on the same day and said, yeah, it's 5%. Now, the reason the plastic recycling industry doesn't like this chart, and I've heard various criticisms, is number one, they say, well, that's all plastic waste. We should not be talking about all plastic waste in America. We should only be talking about PET bottles, HDPE jugs, and containers. We should only be talking about the recycling rate of what actually is getting recycled. Well, sorry, no, I don't think that's a legitimate argument, because all plastic waste matters, right? All types of plastic waste that are filling up landfills, that are going to incinerators, causing carbon emissions, causing other pollutants in those communities, causing ash and so on, ending up in the landfill. We need to look at all plastic waste in the denominator, right? It all matters, okay? Secondly, then the plastic recycling industry wants to say, oh, but the EPA says that 13.1% of plastic containers are recycled. So that's really the number. It's not, you know, 8%. It was really 13%. Well, that's a distraction too, because that's, if you look carefully at table 8 of the EPA report, it says containers and packaging include bottles and jugs and wraps, but doesn't include plastic cups. That number doesn't include plastic cups, okay? So we have to look in the totality of all the plastic waste that's being made. In fact, looking at plastic cups, the EPA says negligible recycling of plastic cups in America, either the red ones or the clear, the PPE, PSP6, negligible. And yet we still have companies putting recycle symbols on their cups. Now under SB 343, this should change. So we can't just look at containers and packaging in the EPA report because it doesn't include things like this. When advocates like me who say, well, let's ban these, there's alternatives, we should go to reuse, there's other materials to use. The plastics recycling industry comes out and says, oh no, but those are recyclable, right? At the same time, the EPA says they're not getting recycled. So we have to include all plastic waste. And then, you know, I've even seen one argument that says, oh, you can't include durables, you know, that's toilet seats. I've read this in several places. That chart includes toilet seats. So you can't include that in the recycling rate. You know, and in all seriousness on this one, I've lived in this house for 23 years. We've never thrown away a toilet seat once. So the people who are saying this chart isn't legitimate because that's actually all toilet seats. I mean, honestly, I wonder how fast you're going through your toilet seats and if maybe a medical professional should be seen, because this is just not a serious argument when you start bringing up toilet seats. Okay, so the real recycling rate that we've shown is 5%. Beyond Plastics and I published a report. And literally today we hit press and said press. The US DOE came out with the same number. It was incredible coincidence. They actually said it was a little bit worse, 5% in 2019, because we were conservative. Now they called for incineration as a solution to plastic pollution. Okay, so we've got this problem. My argument is this green, whatever you look at this, if you look at this as traffic deaths, as kids not getting educated, and you look at this green line as saying, this is the solution, I say, no, that's not, you wouldn't send your kid to that school that was using that green line as the solution. So we're not gonna recycle our way out of this problem. So what do we need to do? We need to stop greenwashing plastics that aren't recyclable and move to reusable systems or better materials. 2020, we published Greenpeace. I got so sick of seeing all these plastic recyclable labels on all these products. We published Circular Claims Fall Flat. We looked at all 373 MRFs operating in America and what do they accept. And for the first time show, you know, only 1s and 2s bottles and jugs are actually getting accepted and really have the valid reason to have a recycle label. And then we just updated the report and published Circular Claims Fall Flat. Again, the full list, 375 MRFs operating in America is available on Greenpeace's website, my website. If this is wrong, please tell me. We went through and looked and looked and looked. What do you accept? And even if there was sort of a cup, but it didn't say cup, we put in cup in. So this is the only transparent database on this sort of thing. What were the key results of this survey? And I realize I got to talk fast, don't I now, Graham? I'm taking too long. This is really important. Toxicity and economics are the fatal flaws of plastic recycling. And toxicity is not discussed. This is the big elephant in the room. This is the blocker, actually, to recycling plastic back into food grade. Okay, because why? Malathion is sold in PET bottles. It goes into a curbside bin with a PET bottle like this. This can absorb what's in this. The plastics can get mixed up together, not food grade. Nothing can be made from food grade that goes into a curbside bin. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation New Plastics Economy reports completely dismiss toxicity. Okay, it is a mind blower. It is a fatal flaw. And then the economics, we all know it's way more expensive, too tough and everything, but the toxicity is actually what's going to kill it here. And you know, it's no surprise because who was the writer of actually all those New Plastics Economy reports? McKinsey. And McKinsey was the architect of the opioid death crisis. So it's no surprise that this concept that plastic could be safely recycled into food grade, could be circular, was promoted by the same consultants who promoted opioids and that crisis. All right, so what are some of the results? Only 1s and 2s bottles and jugs are recyclable. Yeah, we agree. Put them in your bin. If you use them, try to use less single-use plastics, put them in your bed. And then no type of plastic food service item is recyclable. This is actually the topic that we were going to address today. Not one of these things meets even the acceptance criteria, alone it's being recycled criteria. Those are the 2 criteria. And those are most of the things in the top beach cleanup, right? These are the things. They're not recyclable. It's time to get rid of them, right? If we want to stop plastic pollution, if we want to stop plastic waste, let's ban these things, right? So, and look at them, we're talking about plastic cups, trays, clamshells, all the way down, not recyclable. Did a survey, went around 2021, tried to get everything from everywhere. None of this plastic waste can legally be claimed as recyclable in the US. Definitely won't pass the SB 343 law in California. It's not recyclable. Okay, so we've got to stop greenwashing. Most MRFs have, when you look at the survey of who's accepting what, but there's still some who do. There's still actually some MRFs who accept plastic cutlery. And I asked them, why don't you take this off? And they say, oh, the city wants us to keep it on. But telling consumers that worthless single-use plastics are recycling is preventing progress. It's not just greenwashing single-use plastic. It's actually blocking progress from reducing that waste and then getting to innovations on good products. And then there's the store drop-off charade. And this is finally beginning. It's the beginning of this coming to the end. We've had all these single-use plastics that have been labeled as store drop-off in the US it's really expanded over the last few years. It's never been true. This stuff's never been collected through curbside, curbside, they don't even want it, but through store drop-off. We've asked for substantiation during a recycling commission meeting. I think Nick was there. We asked Amazon to prove that label and they couldn't. But this is all now coming to the end because, yeah, California State Attorney General has finally said this label is not real. These bags aren't recyclable based on their investigations. So what this is going to mean is that the very same label, for example, AG just said this plastic label on this Walmart bag is not recyclable. The same label is on plastic products at Walmart, right? So follow the dots, also not legal. So hopefully we'll see a huge improvement with those labels being taken off. I talked to a major products company this week who's very concerned they're going to be slapped with lawsuits really quickly because of the AG's action. So if you are a brand or you know a brand, you want to warn them against some legal actions or reducing their liability, get those labels off their products as soon as possible. And then let's talk about solutions real quick. Yes, there's solutions, reusables, refillables for beverages. And then there's some great, in my opinion, great paper packaging options coming on the market. We just got these in Portugal. Marty, right? Comes in a paper. There's even ones directly in it now. And this pops, you put it in with this. This could be sold everywhere at Halloween. There's no PFAS. It's all recyclable. We're seeing Kraft move to fiber on their macaroni and cheese products. Kit Kat use some fiber. And then this is a survey we did in France last year, looking at France has bans, right? France has bans on single-use plastics on food service, on fast food, right? They know it's not recyclable, so they're banning it. There's innovation, and all the big companies, for example, Starbucks, are now using paper lids. No PFAS, no plastic. I've had them tested, or I've heard of the tests. I've seen the tests, and nothing on them. And yeah, recyclable, compostable, end up in the ocean, doesn't kill a fish. So this is the kind of innovation that we need to get to. Of course, refillables for beverages, but then there's good fiber innovations coming on the market for fast food. But we will only get there. We will only get to progress when we say certain types of single-use plastics have never been recycled and will never be recycled. And with that, I thank you. Oh, one last thing, recycled content. Someone asked about that. I don't believe in it. I don't believe in it because there's so many ways to cheat it. In California, the plastic bags have a recycled content requirement. And look what CVS does. They import their bags from Germany. So it's not our plastic waste. Who even knows if it really is recycled plastic, because there's no test for that. But they were imported from Germany, and there's no way of stopping that in laws. And then you've got the toxicity issue. So that's why I'm not a fan of recycled content laws. And with that, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Jan. Comprehensive as always. We've got about 8 minutes left and a handful of questions. And folks, if you haven't dropped anything in the chat, you want to raise your hand or put a question in the chat, we will get to it accordingly. But I thought we would start, maybe start with you on this question, Nick, and then Jan, feel free to chime in. But Sandy's wondering what our thoughts are on how extended producer responsibility may help to convince producers to redesign instead of flooding the world with more plastic.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I could probably talk about it for a couple hours at least, as I imagine Jan could as well. Maybe I'll make a little distinction. Yeah, I think people, or maybe even the question, use EPR, right? The 3 capital letter EPR, which means something very specific to people. And for at least our organization, we tend to be advocates of broader producer responsibility. So lowercase p, lowercase r, which might seem like just a semantic distinction, but a lot of folks, a lot of traditional EPR programs rely on the manufacturers running a recycling program, creating a stewardship organization that they run. We think that's a useful tool sometimes. We've sponsored legislation requiring that for paint, for mattresses, for some other things. But there are other forms of producer responsibility. Like I know Jan and I have an ongoing debate about recycled content that's daily. I think we have a daily debate. But in our view, recycled content is a form of producer responsibility because it makes the manufacturers have to create markets for their products. Within the our state bottle bill, we have something called a processing fee that manufacturers have to pay the net cost of recycling their beverages. In addition to the deposit that everyone knows, there's also a fee that manufacturers pay based on the difference between the scrap value of their product and how much it costs to recycle it. So using that broader definition of producer responsibility, I think it can have a really fundamental shift. The reason we have so much crappy disposable stuff is because it's so cheap. It costs nothing to use plastic. And part of producer responsibility is internalizing the costs into the manufacturing process, or putting fees that make consumers aware that there is an environmental cost to dealing with this. So I do think producer responsibility is the solution. I don't think that's limited to what is traditionally referred to as EPR. Super wonky answer. I apologize.
Thanks, Nick. Jan, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I'm very concerned that EPR is just a delay tactic. For example, I'm not a fan of SB 54 in California. I think it just gives the producers 10 more years to fail at plastic recycling. I'm a fan of bottle bills and deposit laws. I am a fan of bans. If we say something has never been recycled in the course of history, then let's ban it if there's a decent alternative, right? And again, we're talking about single-use plastics for fast food and so on, not talking about medical, right? Not talking about these real critical use things. But until you ban something, you won't get a good solution or the market for it. In fact, I talk to the companies that make these things and they say, oh yeah, this has been available on the market, but nobody's buying paper because plastic is so cheap. So it's also creates a market. And then if you're gonna do EPR, it really should just focus on the things that actually have been recycled. I think, for example, food wrap, like this, never in the course of history have these been recycled, and they won't go back into food grade, going into curbside bins. Don't include flexible packaging in the EPR. It just gives the flexible packaging industry 10 more years to fail. Just admit it. We know now it doesn't work. Let's work to find solutions like the paper packaging that Nestle is beginning to use.
Along those lines, Jan, Andrew, and I'm also wondering this myself, but what happens to the plastic grocery bags and the things that are brought back to stores as part of these kind of return to store schemes? They're just landfilled? Is that fair?
Or incinerated. Yeah, or
Incinerated.
incinerated. I've spent a lot of time looking and taking pictures of what's in recycled bins and talking to people in the recycling business and looking at the specifications. In California, there's 3 plastic film recyclers. Their specifications all want super clean, grade A, clear plastic film, like from the back of distribution centers. That's what they use to then create pellets that could go back into this kind of bag. And I've never seen any piece of evidence that any of the stuff. And when you look in the bin, it's always filled with trash and water and food and all this stuff. And so there's only a tiny market for even that back of store, clean film. Trex is like laying off 160 people. I estimate they might have taken about 3% of the plastic film made in America altogether. So that was great. They made the plastic the packaging, but that was only 3% of the market, right? And so so there's still actually a ton of plastic film from back of distribution stores available, cleaner, better, and that's what plastic recyclers gonna use. And so yeah, I think it's all been trashed or incinerated.
Yeah, and again, Jan, I've slightly disagreed on this a little bit. I think in terms of overall, I agree that there is. I think where we slightly disagree is that there is some recycling of the front of house plastic bags, but it's very small, and most of those bins are now gone altogether. It's again changing the paradigm from can you recycle it to does it get recycled, and realistically it doesn't. So it's almost a distinction without a difference of whether or not the little bit that gets collected at the few stores that have bins gets recycled. It doesn't really matter whether you assume it does or it doesn't. The vast majority is clearly not getting recycled.
At least some of it, back when China was taking a lot of our plastic waste, unfortunately, more was collected and might have gotten exported, but that's not happening now. That's the good news. That's not happening now.
Ooh, we got a loaded question here at the 11th hour, Jan. How does TerraCycle fit into this in terms of what is actually getting recycled?
People in the audience may know that I sued TerraCycle and 8 major product companies last year for false claims, false labels, because they were labeling, for example, the plastic bag, late July chips was labeling all of their plastic bags as recyclable through TerraCycle. And then if you went on the website and tried to register, you're put on a 2-year wait list. So you couldn't do it all. So that I think and Bloomberg recently did an article with them with trackers, which is really interesting. But I think that they are greenwashing bad plastics, right? So they're saying, oh, we're going to recycle these really bad things. They even have polystyrene cups, way worse stuff too. And oh, we're going to collect it and recycle it. But really the answer is to make companies change their design. And what companies have been doing is paying TerraCycle a tiny bit of money to put a label on and say, oh, it's recyclable through TerraCycle, instead of spending real money to change their design. And that's where there's more, it's whack-a-mole. More of these things pop up all the time. People are constantly sending them to me because they're playing on the average person, me, everybody's education for the last 30 years that recycling works and recycling's great. So let's have a, new kind of recycle program, that where magic happens. And they're really playing on people's, heartstrings on that. And it's worked. And now we're trying to use facts to overcome the fictions. But it's hard because these fictions are so well ingrained and people really do want to do the right thing. And they've been, and recycling, to be clear, recycling cardboard, paper, glass, metal, do it. Those things work. But yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot of people just trying to come up with scam schemes and make a quick buck.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Nick. We're at 2 minutes past the top of the hour. I want to thank Angelica and the folks at National Recycling Congress for extending the invitation for us to be here today, and everybody who chimed in with your questions and your attention. Really appreciate you being here. I'm going to drop my email in the chat for anyone that would like to reach out with additional questions. Happy to be in touch. And yeah, with that, I think we can all say goodbye. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.